Welcome, everyone. I'm Bonnie Glaser, and I'm Director of the Asia Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'm so glad that you're joining us today for our event on the war in Ukraine and the lessons for Taiwan. We have a really terrific program. The war in Ukraine has been the focus of attention in Europe, in the United States, and many countries around the world. There have been so many published articles and panels that have addressed the issue of the implications of the war, especially for China, and the lessons that Beijing might be drawing from the conflict. And yet, from the early days of the war, I began wondering how this conflict would be viewed in Taiwan and how it would shape Taiwan's policies, its actions, and its planning going forward. So, to be sure, Taiwan is not Ukraine, but there are nevertheless important lessons for Taiwan. And that's the topic of our event today. So, we've invited both lawmakers and experts from Europe and Taiwan to tell us their views about the Ukraine war and what it might mean for Taiwan. And we'll also discuss Europe's interests in the Indo-Pacific region and the role that Europe might play to strengthen security in the Taiwan Strait going forward. So I'm really delighted to have just four terrific panelists today, and let me briefly introduce them. We have a member of Parliament from the EU Parliament, Ms. Anna Fotyga, who's a Polish politician, and she has been a member of the European Parliament since 2014, and she represents the European Conservatives and Reformist groups, and she sits on the Committee on Foreign Affairs. She was previously Minister of Foreign Affairs of Poland and Chief of the Chancellery of the President. Next, we will have Ms. Helena Lagarda, and she is coming to us from Berlin. Ms. Fotyga is today in Strasbourg, so we different cities. Helena Lagarda is a lead analyst at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, known to most of us as MERICS. She's a joint lead also on the China Security Project, which is in collaboration with the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And previously, Ms. Lagarda held positions at the delegation of the European Union to China and the advisory firm China Policy in Beijing. Sitting with me today, and I'm so excited to have both of our Taiwanese participants here with me in Washington, D.C., I have to my immediate left, Mr. Freddie Lim, who is a member of the Legislative Yuan in Taiwan, an independent member, and he is one of the founding leaders of the New Power Party, representing the party in the Legislative Yuan from 2016 to 2019. And he previously served as the lead of Amnesty International Taiwan. And then finally, last but definitely not least, to my far left is Dr. Lai I-Chung, who is the president of the Prospect Foundation, which of course is a leading think tank based in Taiwan. He previously held numerous positions with the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, including executive director for the DPP mission to the United States and Director General for the DPP's Department of China Affairs and the Department of International Affairs. So with those introductions, I am going to turn the floor over to Ms. Fotyga for her remarks. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chair. It is my pleasure and privilege to be present during this outstanding panel. Although it is a very busy day, you can see Strasbourg behind me, Strasbourg view, and it is live, certainly in my office here. We have important day today, annual State of the Union speech of the Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, then debates, very lively debates, and of course Ukraine was extremely important as the conflict, the war of aggression by Russian Federation happening just on our doorsteps. For people like myself, no surprise at all. And actually it was provided in the speech of Madame von der Leyen that representatives of countries of my region, namely Poland, Baltic states, other countries, were very outspoken for decades, or surely from the famous Munich speech and what we read in official Russian strategic documents about policies and plans elaborated in Kremlin. So this concern was voiced a long time ago already. Actually, when we try to speak about lessons for Taiwan here in the European Parliament, but also elsewhere, my experience with Taiwan is quite early because I started my career in the Foreign Office of Polish Solidarność. That was actually the independent, somehow, the independent foreign ministry under communism, the communist rule. And from this time, I was already trying to monitor developments in PRC. And naturally, since 1989, Taiwan used to be in the focus also, with all constraints to this of many Polish politicians, surely myself, because it is already many years when I engaged in both monitoring and staying outspoken in Taiwan's issues. Let me recall one event at the beginning of my second, because I started my career in the European Parliament in 2004, immediately after Poland's accession to the EU. And I remember a visit of representative of Taiwan to Brussels, and speaking with highest concern about developments in Hong Kong. It was exactly in 2014, and showing possibility to patterns step by step used first in intimidating people staying outspoken in fighting for their rights and freedoms there in Hong Kong, and possibility for Taiwan being the second target of PRC, whenever harsh measures vis-a-vis Hong Kong are to succeed. Of course, we are very outspoken. We used to table resolutions and vote successful resolutions defending Hong Kong freedom fighters for quite a long time already. Now we focus on Taiwan. Even yesterday, it was debate with participation of High Vice President of the Commission, High Representative Josep Borrell. So in our surrounding, quite high-ranking debate on situation of Taiwan, in particular, focusing on developments after the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan, actually daily violation of both Taiwan's Strait median lines, or status quo between PRC and Taiwan. But it's just an example, because those violations that we are aware of and that we try to raise on daily basis actually are still in place. I would like to say that in particular, in view of war in the Ukraine, aggression of Russia in Ukraine, we have to mention the declaration signed between Russian Federation and PRC in Beijing on 4th of February, elaborating areas of very close cooperation. It is very visible, and I think that for Taiwan's authorities and elites, it is more than clear that vibrant democracy, because Taiwan is a vibrant democracy in Indo-Pacific region. It's a gateway also to guard or to enable freedom of navigation for whole collective West. It is extremely important. For the EU is one of the main partner in trade partner in very specific and very important areas of trade. So I think that because of all those things, Taiwan was our ally, is a like-minded country in combating COVID. From the very beginning, assisting European states and rest of the world also in providing materials to combat pandemics. It is surely very active country in supporting our stance, our position in terms of opposing Russian war of aggression and unbelievable atrocities happening there in Ukraine. Taiwan stays aligned with us. Actually, I try to keep engaged in Taiwanese affairs, having very close contact with representation here. We support countries that undergo PRC coercion because of their engagement, like Lithuania, Czechia, and others. Of course, it is extremely important to oppose the attempts to isolate Taiwan in international arena, like in WHO, and that we support for quite a long time, since very beginning when this coercion happened as well, and in other places. In my opinion, it is extremely important to know that for collective West, Taiwan is extremely valuable source of expertise of ways and means of the PRC activities abroad and broadening the sphere of influence, also more and more aggressive. Maybe I'll stop here, and I'm of course ready to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Ms. Fotyga. We will come back to you definitely with questions. Let me just remind the audience that I do hope that we will be able to engage some of you in the conversation who are watching us virtually. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat box or in the comments section, and we will collate your questions and we will pose them later. I'm going to next turn to Helena Legarda, again joining us from Berlin. Please, Helena, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. It's a pleasure to be able to join this fantastic panel to discuss such an important topic. Ms. Fotyga already did a great job at explaining why Taiwan is so important to Europe, to the EU, and to European member states. So I will focus a bit more on the lessons that the EU is drawing or can draw from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and how those may apply to a Taiwan contingency. The EU and European member states are increasingly concerned about a potential Chinese attack against Taiwan. That's become evident by debates in the European Parliament, statements and interviews by ministers and heads of state across Europe. So that is a concern that's real, and it's partly driven by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. One of the key lessons, I think, that Europe has drawn from the war against Ukraine is the fact that economic interdependence doesn't necessarily stop or prevent wars and invasions, which is something that, of course, applies very clearly to European economic interdependence with China and to Taiwan's economic interdependence with the PRC as well. Would that be enough to stop a war? Well, it wasn't in the case of Ukraine. A second lesson that I think Europe is drawing from this is the fact that information is key, and controlling the information space is also incredibly important. And here we're talking both about fighting disinformation and misinformation, which is a very clear priority for the EU when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And it was again mentioned by Commission President von der Leyen this morning at the State of the European Union speech. But it's also very important, as we have seen, when it comes to shaping the narrative around the conflict. And this is something that Ukraine and the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people have done very successfully. And that helps. That helps secure international support, and that helps also inspire confidence in the government that being able to manage the conflict, which in turn has a huge impact on public opinion across Europe, which has also created the, I guess, public pressure on certain governments that were maybe more reluctant to support Ukraine, for example, with weapons deliveries. So information space and shaping the narrative and fighting misinformation and disinformation, another key lesson. Third one, I would mention the fact that the delivery of support to the country being attacked, in this case, Ukraine, in a potential future case, Taiwan, and this is also military support, weapons, is very important and has to come in the worst case scenario very early in the conflict, in the best case scenario before the conflict. And as I mentioned, this of course applies to weapons, but also to training. One of the key lessons from the Ukrainian military's performance since Russia invaded the country is the fact that the training programs that took place since 2014, when Russia first attacked Ukraine, have played a very important role in making sure that the Ukrainian military has been able to hold off the Russian aggression. The monitoring of developments and having accurate intelligence, also a very key lesson to be drawn. As Ms. Fotyga was saying, there had been warnings that the Russian military was moving and amassing forces next to the Ukrainian border. Across Europe, that information wasn't believed across the board, and it wasn't shared, I think, very consistently. So accuracy of information, intelligence sharing, I think another lesson that we can draw for a potential Taiwan scenario. And maybe I'll finish off with another one that I think sanctions after the fact work, even if they are unpredictable, but they can be economically very painful. They have been, the sanctions in Russia have been very painful for Europe, especially in the energy sector, and consensus is not easy to come by. As you all know, at the EU level, all member states need to agree on these sanctions. This was difficult in the case of Russia. The EU got there, but it was a difficult conversation. It will be harder in the case of China, because economic ties between European member states and China are deeper and more comprehensive than they are with Russia. So keeping all of these in mind, what can Europe do to strengthen deterrence in the Taiwan Strait? Ideally before an attack is launched rather than after. And I think there's a number of things. Militarily speaking, Europe will play a much more limited role than I think that the United States or other countries in the region, and that's simply based on the reality of geographical distance and the available military capabilities. But there are still things that can be done, as in the case of Ukraine, when it comes to training, when it comes to the delivery of certain capabilities, and when it comes to intelligence sharing mechanisms that Europe and Taiwan have to a certain extent, but they're fairly limited. So much more could be done in that space. Politically and economically, Ms. Fotyga already mentioned to the fact that Europe should strengthen ties with Taiwan and should make sure that Taiwan doesn't end up isolated. But it's a thing on the economic front when the EU can play the most important role. The EU is an economic superpower, globally speaking. And I think it should be a key objective of the European Union, as the European Parliament has been discussing yesterday already, to make very clear that any sort of aggression against Taiwan by the PRC would be met with tough sanctions and would imply a very high cost for Beijing. And this should be believable, which means, from my perspective, that it is the job of the EU to start prepping the field. And what does that imply? Well, as we have heard a number of European policymakers mention, most recently here in Germany, it involves being a bit less naive when it comes to economic and commercial ties with China. It implies diversifying as much as possible. It implies trying to reduce dependencies. And it implies starting a process to try and build consensus across EU member states already on the fact that the EU will act and should act immediately after an attack against Taiwan. Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a fairly rude awakening for many in Europe. As Ms. Fotyga mentioned, in some European member states, this was more expected. In some others, not so much. This means that, from my perspective, there is an opening at the moment for the EU to strengthen ties with Taiwan, to try to decouple its China policy from its Taiwan policy somewhat, and to start preparing for an adequate response in case of conflict. And we're already seeing shifts in this regard, in the tone, in the presence of Taiwan in debates, and also in terms of trade policy. Here in Germany, in particular, the economics ministry said yesterday that we have to be less naive on China because we can't allow ourselves to be blackmailed. Again, drawing a lesson from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the aftermath, and applying it to a potential China-Taiwan scenario. This all sounds very hopeful. I will note that there is still reluctance in many corners of Europe to shift approach and to change the long-term strategies that we've had when it comes to relations with China and to damage those economic ties. So there's still some work to be done on this front, but I'm fairly hopeful. I think we're seeing movement, and I think some, at least, of these lessons from Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine will be distilled by the EU and European member states and applied to a potential Taiwan scenario. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. In the discussion, I think we'll come back to some of the points that you have raised. Again, to our audience, you can put questions in the chat, and we will raise them with our speakers later. Next, we're going to turn to Mr. Freddie Lim. And I know that many people in Taiwan have paid very close attention to this war. I heard that on television, social media, that there was quite a bit of reporting and attention to the war. So tell us what the perspectives have been in Taiwan and what the lessons are that Taiwan is learning and should be learning.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Moderator Glaser and also all my European colleagues that we have this chance to exchange our ideas, and a lot of good points that you have already shared, and some of the points I will follow. But first of all, I want to share from the Taiwanese perspective. But first of all, I want to thank to my Polish colleague here that actually a lot of support from Taiwan to Ukraine actually shipped to Poland, and then you help us to deliver to Ukraine. So thanks to the Polish people and my Polish colleague. And so go back to the Taiwanese perspective. I think after the Russians' invasion in Ukraine, I think Taiwanese people have given up on the appeasement narratives to the dictatorships. That back in the last few decades, that I think the mainstream narrative of Taiwan society is that let's give it's kind of appeasement, like let's give China more time, and step by step, China will have their political reform along with the development of economy or their technology, and they will the political reform will come along. That kind of narrative, not just shared by those scholars, but also very important politicians, not just the KMT, the main opposition party now used to be the governing party, used to be the authoritarian regime, that they try to share this kind of narrative to most of Taiwanese people, and a lot of Taiwanese people bought that kind of idea. And with that kind of narrative, Russia has always been a very important case that they raise up to the Taiwanese people, saying like, seeing what happened to Soviet Union, they collapsed. So just give China time, just like what happened in Soviet Union and Russia established their democracy step by step. China will be the next. So they use Russia as an example to educate Taiwan that China will be next Russia. And I think we all know that not just after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, but Russia has never been a democratic country, not even after the collapse of Soviet Union. We all know that. But those politicians or scholars in Taiwan, or they sell this kind of story to Taiwanese people, use Russia as a very important example to Taiwanese people. But what happened in Ukraine this year? Just a huge awakening to all the Taiwanese society, because they used to believe this kind of narrative, this kind of story, that China will be the next Russia. So if China be the next Russia, which means China will attack Taiwan. So the whole narrative, the whole story they sell, just I think just bankrupt. So I think the whole society of Taiwanese people, they don't really buy that kind of story anymore. And the main lesson that we learn from the Ukraine, what happened in Ukraine, is that the only thing we can do is to strengthen our national security. The only thing we can do is to show to the Chinese authoritarian regime that the will of Taiwanese. That's the only way. We show our will, we defend our land, and then the international society, the international friends community will support us, just like what happened in Ukraine. So I think that's the main lesson. And although there are still some politicians still try to continue that kind of narratives, but it's not a mainstream anymore. And the mainstream and the people in Taiwan will criticize those politicians that why you are still selling this kind of story. There must be some kind of things behind under the table you are thinking, since the reality is not like what you are saying. And talking about and right here, I really want to emphasize the change of the younger generation, because I think the Taiwanese younger generation, the youth in Taiwan, is just like everywhere else, that they were kind of passive on the political issues. They are more concerned about they're concerned more about the livelihood issues, such as the salary or housing. But after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, I think the youth, they show the strongest will about defend our country. And I have participated in an event that gathered hundreds of representatives from universities, and the issue that they concern most that they voted for is the international status of Taiwan. That's supported by the majority of the representatives and surpassed all the other issues. So I think that's the very strong signal. And all those books about the national security or about the civic security, they are the best sellers in Taiwan in the bookshops right now. So that's something never happened in the last few decades. And then talking about the military aspect, I think the government also use this. I don't want to say use with this kind of strong will. I think the government tried to speed up the reform of our military. And one thing is that to try to put more resources focusing on the so-called asymmetric strategy. Although we all know that, I think some of you might know that our military established back in the old days in the authoritarian regime controlling Taiwan, they used to fantasize that they want to invade China, to take over China, the KMT regime. So our military established based on that kind of ideology. So although the reform has been going on for decades since early 90s, but there are still a lot of old thinkings, old ideologies, old way of works. Especially also in case of the weaponry acquisition. They still have that kind of old idea of comparing our military size with China instead of focusing on the asymmetric strategy. But I can see that the whole society of Taiwan and also our military and national defense military nowadays, they try to speed up the reform to focus on the right thing, the right weapon we need, the right direction that we should go for. And the other thing is that they tried. I think our presidents just start the reform of the reserve force, and also try to make the period of the conscription military longer back, and also to see how we can allocate the resources based on the asymmetric strategy. So I think that's one thing that we see clearly, especially I served in the National Defense and Foreign Affairs Committee in the Parliament for 6 years. I see, and also our budget on military, on national defense is growing up with the support of Taiwanese people. So I think that's a very very positive signal, not just to Taiwanese, but also to the world, to let the world that we are preparing to defend ourselves. So I think that's something that from my perspective from Taiwan, and I think that's it for now. And I believe my old good friend Lai I-Chung will add up more things that he has observed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Terrific remarks. Okay, we'll turn to you, Lai I-Chung. Please help us understand more about what lessons Taiwan is learning from the conflict in Ukraine.
Thank you, Bonnie, and thanks for inviting me for this very important panel and join with these distinguished panelists. I will say that just to supplement what the legislator Freddie Lim just said. First of all, I would think that in Taiwan, many people before the February 24th did not anticipate, including analysts, did not anticipate that Putin actually launched attack against Ukraine, which in terms of all the rational thinking, that is just not costly benefit. But Putin did. And so that makes a lot of people, including analytical society in Taiwan, started to re-examine many of the assumptions that we think about the authoritarian leaders, their behavior and how the decisions they are going to make, including what kind of information that be fit into the circle under that kind of environment. And also that makes a lot of people in Taiwan, including the top echelons, believing that the likelihood for the war on Taiwan is coming much closer than we anticipated. So there's a heightened sense of the urgency for the security of Taiwan. That's definitely there. And second is that with the February 4th, China and Russia, they have a joint statement and talks about how the unlimited their cooperation will be, and also the subsequent Chinese behavior in whether that's assisting Russia privately or publicly decrying the United States and the West help to assist the Ukraine in resisting the invasions. All the behavior seem to suggest that there's now the not only the China-Russia cooperation, but this actually there's an axis about the authoritarian regime. They are aiming at the liberal democratic orders in general, and they want to change that. So that makes the geopolitically the Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and the possible conflict in Taiwan that start to link together. So there's a new linkage between the two sides of the Euro-Asian continent on the west, and right now the war in Ukraine on the east. That possible war on Taiwan. So this deeper linkage that makes people to believe that anything happen between Taiwan and the Ukraine, the internal linkage as well as what Ukraine is doing right now will have an effect on Taiwan. So a lot of people right now in Taiwan, they are rooting for the Ukraine's advancement and that they're cheering for it. I look at from all the social media that many people actually look at the Ukraine's victory as the victory for Taiwan.
So they were like, ooh,
yeah,
recently.
So that's good. Yeah. And the third thing is that what we found out, especially during the different phases of Ukraine resistance, the Ukraine can do it, and so that empower a lot of Taiwanese people, especially early on, that for our resistance to protect our own country against the Chinese possible invasions, we could actually win out. We could outlast them. So that is one of the another can-do spirit that started to emerge within the Taiwanese society. And so that with one of the development is that right after the invasion of Ukraine, especially when the Ukraine was able to sustain for more than 1 week, then all kind of discussion in Taiwan about what we can learn from Ukraine, what kind of resistance they are providing us, and how we can strengthen our own defense. That group and the discussion not only emerged, but a lot of civil society initiative to boost up the preparedness for Taiwan, how to prepare people in wartime, how to get this necessary skill set for Taiwanese people to be able to contribute to our defense. That activity and initiative spring out in the society and continue until today. And of course, it's going to be a little bit tactical. That is, in our analytical society, when they analyze the several phases of the war in Ukraine, the first phase definitely demonstrates the effectiveness of the so-called asymmetric defense and weaponaries. It successfully prevented Russia's further advancement, and people learned the lesson from that. So there's a wider acceptance, not only within the society, but also with the military establishment regarding the effectiveness and the necessity for the asymmetrical defense. But then in the second phase and third phase, what people discovered is that the asymmetrical defense is good in terms of prevent on the defense against the advancement. But it still has a limitation in terms of really turn the outlook of the war itself. And so that, especially with the recent Ukraine successful advancement in reclaim some of their lost land, in addition to their tactic, where they are able to divert the Russians' focus in one area and really take another area. But some of the capabilities that a more traditional platform can provide, and also make people to realize that for Taiwan, we have to prepare for different phases and missions in order to have a successful defense. And the defense is not just going to be just one period and for one mission. We have to think in longer term. So the whole war on Taiwan probably will last for a longer period, and we need to prepare for all of those. And different period will require different missions, and the different mission will require different capabilities. So that asymmetrical defense and some of the capability that provided by the traditional platforms are also important. So that actually makes the whole debate within Taiwan about the defense strategy more fruitful and more thoughtful. And right now, the discussion basically focus on what is the proper balance between asymmetrical defense capabilities and some of the capability traditional platform provide for the better defense of Taiwan. So I'll just stop here. Thank you.
Great, terrific remarks by all of you. We do have a few questions that have come in. I'm going to start with one of my own, and I'd like to pose it to Ms. Fotyga. Helena described, I think, quite well the importance of the sanctions on Russia that the Western countries and of course many countries in Asia joined the international sanctions effort quite early. And I think that some of the measures that were taken were quite surprising, particularly the willingness to freeze Russia's central bank assets. And many people have asked me whether European countries and whether the United States, whether our allies in Asia would be willing to impose those kinds of really biting sanctions on China, given the degree of economic interdependence and dependence that we all have on China. And yet signaling this in peacetime, our will to do so, to talk with each other about what kind of sanctions we would be willing to implement, and then to signal that to China. This could be a means of strengthening deterrence. So I'd like to hear your perspectives on the potential for actually doing something like that in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Actually, I would like to start with quite general remark that because we may think separately about sanctions, but we have to know also the setting. And setting is that both actors, both Russian Federation and actually Russia under all state orders, because it was Tsarist Russia, the Soviet Union, and now Russian Federation, are quite accustomed to perpetrate genocide. I can name whole nations and ethnic groups that do this. And same thing applies to PRC. There is Uyghur community and Xinjiang province, and we know all of this. And our obligation as public figures in the international scene is to prevent it immediately by all means. So what I'm afraid of is that for too long, business simply prevailed over the general international legal order. So now we have simply put our house in place, in order, return to I would say, deeply rooted principles, and I'm not realistic in this. Actually, I see that this action is difficult, of course, to nations and countries, elites, to align with necessary policy to deter this kind of actors is difficult, but it does work. We are able to achieve a very fragile and difficult unity in terms of sanctions against Russia. Also, not only applied on Russia, but when we speak about Russian war in Ukraine, there is also Belarusian regime. Different because in Belarus, majority of society opposes Lukashenko policy. So we do differentiate, yet try to impose mirror sanctions on Belarus for allowing territory to be used by aggressive forces. And our reaction to already now to PRC policies is inadequate as well. Also in view of this knowledge and those policies we are aware of. It was business prevailing in relationship, and as Taiwanese colleagues told, I would say naivety in assessment of developments in case of previous stance of Taiwan's or majority of Taiwan's society, because Russian policies were absolutely visible, and all this important. We have to remember when we speak about PRC also that before import the preparation to full-scale invasion of Ukraine started quite a long time ago with internal consolidation and militarization of the state. And it is extremely important to observe the same measures taken within PRC, in particular in run-up to the Autumn Party Congress. So we have to be vigilant, but positive news is also coming from Ukraine, that it is possible for David to defeat Goliath.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take a question from one of our viewers. Robert Delaney from the South China Morning Post has asked a question about the Taiwan Policy Act, which, as we sit here today in Washington, D.C., is being marked up in the Senate. It's a very comprehensive bill. It has, for the first time, a provision to consider giving foreign military financing to Taiwan, which would mean giving our dollars to Taiwan to purchase weapons going forward. There are other very important security and defense provisions, but there are also some provisions which, frankly, are somewhat controversial that relate to changing the office of the name of the Taiwan's, the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office to possibly the Taiwan Representative Office. And then there are other provisions, such as having the Senate confirm the U.S. representative in Taipei at the American Institute for Taiwan. And there are, of course, many other provisions. But the question is whether you think the law would create more security, would it strengthen Taiwan's security, or would it undermine Taiwan's security? What is your general view of this? So maybe start with you, Lai I-Chung.
Yeah, thank you. I think today the mark of the Taiwan Policy Act definitely represents another signal from Congress about the importance of Taiwan and what they want to do with Taiwan. I think some of the so-called controversial part, basically, I will just leave for the United States for them to decide. There are the congressional different angles about what they believe that this could contribute, or actually not contributing to the security of Taiwan. But I would say that some of those the issues, such as changing the name from the office of the Taipei to Taiwan, there's no controversy in Taiwan. So that, yeah, I think everyone in Taiwan basically welcome if there's the right timing, and if things that can actually work, and I think a lot of people will welcome that. I think right now probably the most important part is still the security issue on Taiwan, and that especially after the August Chinese exercise on Taiwan, that people are paying much more attention, and how the China will do, as well as in future development. That is something that on people's mind. And currently, we wanted to deal with the so-called Chinese push for the new normal, erasing the mainland Taiwan Straits, close proximity of the vessels exercise just daily in the continuous zone of Taiwan, as well as the other action that try to erase the sovereignty of Taiwan. So those are the things that we need to meet, and we hope that the Taiwan Policy Act and some of the action first it represents signals to the China that despite what you're doing here, that there's no detriment to the Taiwan-U.S. relationship. And second, I'll say that in my own particularly, due to the resource differences between Taiwan and China, and it apparently plays a huge limitations about what we can do and what we cannot do. The foreign military finances actually provide another way for us to enhance our capabilities and adding more resources. So I personally very much want that to be part of it. And also, if it's possible, the Leasing Act, that we could also have more the weaponry that we wanted and capability that we needed for defend of Taiwan. So those are the two things I desperately wanted to see them to be included and passed on from the Congress. Of course, different people have different priority, but those are my two priorities.
Legislator Lim, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think of course, I think most of Taiwanese people think that it's the most important thing is to strengthen our own capability of the defense. So I think we won't really rely our future on U.S. supports or some foreign supports, but I think any supports, make the supports more on the table, more clarified, we are all welcome, because it will show the signal to Beijing that don't understand the situation the wrong way. Don't consider that no one is with us. Don't consider Taiwan is still alone, like a few decades ago. That we have friends, that our allies are with us, and make all these commitment, make all these promises on the table. I think it's very important. Don't let them hide in somewhere or have agreement with us on the table. That won't work anymore. That's one of the lessons that we learned from Ukraine as well. And the other thing, what I want to add on is that I think about the name of the Taiwan Representative Office. I think not just to, like we call it Taiwan Representative Office, so we just let it naturally called Taiwan Representative Office. But instead of replace Taipei with Taiwan, I think more important thing is that Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office just limit Taiwan's participate in the international community. Just like what we are sharing right now, we are not sharing about economic trading or cultural exchanges between Taiwan and the US, right? We are sharing general everything. Taiwan contribute to the world in every way. Regional security definitely very important. So I think if we limit Taiwan's participate in only economic area and also cultural area, that's just not realistic. So let's just naturally let what Taiwan is doing, is contributing in the world, have a name represent what we are doing. I think that's very important.
I do want to follow up just with a question that obviously when countries like the United States and in Europe take some actions to help Taiwan, there are consequences. Yeah. We know this. And we saw pretty large-scale Chinese military exercises after Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan. So a natural question that people ask is, how do you think about the costs and the benefits? Do you believe that regardless of how China reacts, that we should continue to take these measures supporting Taiwan? Because I worry about the impact on Taiwan's security. I want to see Taiwan safe. And so I always think about what the benefits would be of any particular policy, and then the costs and the risks. So if you had this kind of resolution pass, certainly there would be consequences for Taiwan. So how do you think about that? And are there some things that maybe we should not do because the impact on Taiwan might be devastating?
I will say that I personally believe that the Taiwan Policy Act or many of the actions by the United States, China is not reacting to that. Chinese actually triggered those. Taiwan Policy Act, especially the one that probably a little bit controversial in its own sense, is that about to rewrite a Taiwan Relations Act, for example. That I remember that back in the days of the 6-year assurances, the Taiwan Relations Act was in there, not to be rewritten. So that with the introduction of this act, basically is to meet the new challenge by China, the erasing and the trying to establish new status quo. And also we need to remember that China started this military harassment way before U.S. sent ships into the Taiwan Strait. So I personally would say that this is the reaction toward Chinese initiative. And of course, China will try to do something to double down and to press ahead. And Taiwan, some people will argue that Taiwan will face a consequence. Yes, we do. But what we wanted to do is actually instead of let China to dictate both the action initiative and also the narrative, at least we need to fight back in one narrative. That is, this is not caused by us. This is your action that caused this. And of course, for the actions about what China do, we need to figure something out. And also, I believe that the August exercise is not a reaction toward the Nancy Pelosi Spirit House visit. It's actually something they already planned for a long time, and they just try to bring something out. And they use this as a pretext, try to blame the United States for Chinese action, how that's close. But we need to see through the narrative battle that China wanted to create. We should not put ourselves into their trap.
Great. Okay, let's go back to you, Helena. I'd like you to tell us more about perspectives in Europe. There's obviously so much focus on the war in Ukraine. We've seen the tide turn over the last few days in favor of Ukrainian forces. I think we all hope that this war will be over soon. If it is, Ukraine faces massive reconstruction. We are at the German Marshall Fund. We've been working on a Marshall Plan for the reconstruction of Ukraine. And so resources, of course, will very much be focused there, and attention. And if, unfortunately, the war goes on, that attention and resources will continue to be focused on Ukraine. So how do we really stimulate more focus, attention, and support in Europe for Taiwan? What more can we do? What are there things that Taiwan and the United States should be doing in order to engage Europe and promote a more proactive stance where possible?
Thanks, Bonnie. That's a great question. I mean, first of all, I don't think attention on Ukraine and attention on Taiwan are mutually exclusive. I think we should try and keep up both. And to a certain extent, China and Russia are doing this job for us. Taiwan always makes headlines and remains a priority with every statement or instance of China-Russia cooperation. Every instance of Beijing expressing support for Russia's actions in Ukraine. Every instance of Russian officials mentioning Taiwan, that immediately brings the topic of the linkages between the war in Ukraine and a potential Taiwan contingency up to the top of the priority list. As we've seen this last few days with Lai I-Chung in Moscow speaking to the Russian Duma, and as we've seen from the video expressing support for Russia's actions in Ukraine. We have the Xi Jinping Putin rumored meeting coming up later this week. So we'll see what comes up there. But as long as China and Russia continue cooperating and continue expressing support for each other's positions and continue basically strengthening their commitment to fight against the rules-based international order and the West at large, I think Taiwan will not be forgotten and will not be ignored. So I think they are doing part of the job for us. There's still work that we can do from research institutes, think tanks, the media as well, in terms of drawing these lessons, writing about Taiwan, and making sure that a potential Taiwan contingency, that Taiwan-Europe relations or Taiwan-US relations remain a topic of interest. But again, due to current events and developments, I don't think there's a huge risk at the moment that Taiwan will just drop down the list.
Great, I'm glad to hear that. Ms. Fotyga, maybe you can give us the perspective from your position in Parliament. I understand that there is a new bill that is being considered that contains some provisions to further support Taiwan, and there has been consistent support in the EU Parliament for example, a bilateral investment treaty with Taiwan. My own view is that Taiwan's economic prosperity is so closely linked to its security, and countries really need to do more to ensure that Taiwan's economy is prosperous, especially as Taiwan has been left out largely from the process of trade liberalization and economic integration in the Indo-Pacific region. Taiwan has applied to join the CPTPP. We don't know what the prospects are yet, but it has been excluded from the regional comprehensive economic partnership, and even the United States effort, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, so far does not include Taiwan. So I'd be interested in your perspectives on that.
Oh, yeah, it is certainly delicate question, but it needs our attention, and even more and more attention. Of course, in all official EU statements, and also in EU member states, official statements, there is always repeating the principle of one China policy. But I would like to remind that there is a second part to this description. It is one China, two systems. And generally speaking, with the crackdown on Hong Kong, violating both basic law and other agreements, international laws and agreements, it's visible the policy there already. So I think that step by step, inch by inch, international community, even without making I would say fundamental changes, tries to integrate and take into account Taiwan's presence, Taiwan's interests, and looking on PRC policies with a very sober eye now. I think it is more and more visible. I remember discussions in I would say short period preceding the conclusion of investment, EU-China investment agreement. It was quite famous meeting and act EU-China summit. But then debates, including important debates in the European Parliament, opposing by very prominent senior outspoken MEPs of this agreement, and with I would say that help, assistance of Xi Jinping's policies, we were able to achieve what was even difficult to imagine just few weeks earlier. So suspension of the agreement, and now nobody is willing even to speak about this. So I'm quite optimistic. I think that interest of whole collective West is to ensure first freedom of navigation and proper maritime routes between Europe and US, Canada, and Far East. The passage is extremely important, and well, I'm very cautiously but optimistic. I think, of course, there were threats by PRC, yet calculation also, it looks there is, and currently slightly more than within Russian Federation. But I agree with Helena that, in my opinion, it is no time for strategic sequencing for the West and prioritizing, because unfortunately we see threats in many places, in particular in our immediate neighborhood in Ukraine, namely in Ukraine and Belarus. For me, it is as well, and farther east, but also by PRC policies in Indo-Pacific, in particular vis-a-vis Taiwan, and we have to face it.
I'm going to turn to another question from our virtual audience, and if there are other questions, we still have a few minutes, so please send them in, put them in the chat box. We do have a question from Jan Willem Schulten from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands about how the military failure of the Russians in Ukraine is influencing the calculus of the leadership in Beijing. And this really goes back to the beginning of the war, where some people argued that the Russian invasion of Ukraine would embolden Xi Jinping, and other people argued that it would induce caution. I mean, for, of course, many reasons. It is far more difficult for China to cross the 100 miles of water and establish a landing and then exert control over Taiwan than it was for Russia to have its tanks roll across a land border. Now, of course, the PLA has been, I think, planning this potential invasion of Taiwan for a long time, but they have virtually no combat experience, not since 1979. They study all foreign wars. We know that. They draw lessons. So people ask, well, what lessons will they be drawing from this war? So start with you, Lai I-Chung. What do you think?
Well, I think there are just like two angles, as you said. There are people who argue that the Chinese will learn from this and will be more cautious, especially looking at the failure in the Russians' experiences. And since many of the Chinese weaponry as well doctrine, they learn from Russia, and so that this development will make Chinese military leadership to think twice. But the issue is that the Chinese decision to fight a war is not from the military leadership; it's actually from political leadership, Xi Jinping. So it all goes back how the Xi Jinping would take from this lesson. Another view is that the Chinese decision on launching war against Taiwan is purely on the political, not the military, so that it would not be affected. I would say that when we look at the development and especially on the August exercise on Taiwan, it seems to indicate that China, this did not hinder Chinese intention to invade Taiwan or change the schedule themselves, but it could affect their tactic. One of them is that In the past, we all assumed that China would try to capture Taiwan because it's a big prize. They do not want to waste any resources, and they wanted to capture Taiwan quickly and surprisingly. But then this high cost of the Russians' invasion could make China to think about whether this approach actually is cost benefit, or they could just go to a wider and more coercive raison on Taiwan, such as a blockade. And then when they are able to effectively block US out, then they launch the final attack on Taiwan. And this is something that we think the August exercise sort of indicated. One of the such intention or direction China military probably could use. And so we're still in the process of learning what Chinese are learning. But the more and more evidence seems to suggest that they are also developing other different scenarios in issue about Taiwan.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, just like what Dr. Lai said, that we are still learning what the Chinese government is learning. But I think there is a nature that we have to, personally, I believe in that actually, we democratic countries that we don't like to have conflicts. We don't. We try to cease. We try to stop all those military threats from the authoritarian regime. So we want to make peace that can let us to gain the legitimacy inside our domestic politics. That if we can make the war more prosperous and more peaceful, that's our goal in a democratic country as a democratic politicians. But I do believe that in China or Russia, in that kind of country, they need conflicts to remain their legitimacy in their country, because there's no way to solve their domestic political issues, because they want to stay power, they want to control. There's no other way. There's no election to fix what's wrong inside their country. So they always need international conflicts. So that's an unfair game that we try to play a game to stop conflicts. They want to try to play a game to start the conflicts, and that's an unfair game. So I would say that what they learn from Russia, there will be plenty of issues that we can talk about. But one thing is that they will never stop their military threats in Indo-Pacific because they need it.
I'll ask one small question in our just final few minutes. Lai I-Chung, you talked earlier about how civilians want to defend your country, and I'd like to know, we've talked about this, the possibility of a territorial defense force, and some in Taiwan have advocated this, because civilian defense may not be as effective if it's bottom up than if it's really top down. So does the government in Taiwan support creating a territorial defense force, and has the legislature in any way been involved in this discussion?
About this, what I found out is that the government idea, especially from military idea about the reserve reform, basically they're still treating those reserves as a replacement for the regular military. And so the Ukraine type or the Poland type of the territorial defense force, that idea hasn't really been integrated or developed in Taiwan, because for the military side, they would worry about whether those civilian they're effective fighting powers. But it seems that it boils down to what kind of mission you want those forces to perform. There are the mission that in actual combat, or the combat support, or the combat management. So those are two very different issues, and probably we need some of the unit like TDF to do some other things, so that the our regular army will do the focus just on the combat itself. And I think the government is still in the process trying to reform the whole thing. About the TDF, which I hope that it will come out pretty soon, especially with all the civilian society initiative. It will be a mess. It will be pity if we do not try to integrate that, because it's such a potent social sentiment. They want to do something for this country.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
Terrific. Well, we've reached the end of our time, and I'm just so delighted to have had the opportunity to bring together parliamentarians from Taiwan and Europe and experts from Taiwan and Europe for this very important conversation on the implications of the Ukraine war for Taiwan. Thank you again to Ms. Fotyga joining us from Strasbourg, Helena Legarda, who is coming to us from Berlin, and with me here in Washington, D.C., legislator Freddie Lim and the head of the Prospect Foundation, Lai I-Chung. And thank you so much, all of our viewers, for tuning in today and joining our conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.